Welcome to the Digital Planning Podcast. This series is designed to educate individuals about all things digital in connection with estate planning, business planning, and estate administration. To keep up with all things digital, please subscribe to iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, or wherever you download your podcasts. And now, Jennifer Ziegel, a partner at Kleinberg LLC, Ross Bruck, a principal of Estate Genie, and Justin Brown, a partner at Troutman Pepperell Hamilton Sanders LLP, with today's topic.
Welcome back to the Digital Planning Podcast. I'm your host, Jen, and I'm with my co-hosts, Justin and Ross, and we are here with a very special guest, Ed Zabar, who is the CEO and founder of Verify, which is a company that began in 2017 with the mission to give people control over their own identities while creating a more efficient process of identity verification, privacy, and compliance. Verify has grown over the last few years into a tremendously successful company, and it's serving clients globally in this area. Welcome, Ed.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for having me.
So what prompted you to start Verify and bring you into the digital ID space?
So I started Verify as an idea when I was an investment banker. I saw some inefficiencies in the identification of credentials that had to do with transactions happening and I thought that the solution to that, a little bit counterintuitively, would be to give the data back to the user. So I started that as an ideation, and then when we started Verify in earnest in the beginning of 2017, we really developed towards that of giving people the ability to get an understanding of what's out there about them and have validated data, and then use the data as they see fit and give access to it to whomever they want. So that's how the whole process started.
Can you define for us what you mean by digital identity?
That's a great question, because I think a lot of people have some misconceptions about digital identity, or their own conceptions, maybe not misconceptions. But digital identity is, to us, is an aggregation of various types of data that are used to identify a person in a well-defined, well-auditable way versus other ways. So a lot of companies call themselves digital identity company because they scan government documents and thus they hold information about individuals. We think that one is it's not primary source data. Second, they don't have full knowledge if the validity of the information is correct. And then they're not using any other resources to validate the information. So we see digital identity as an aggregation of building blocks, and it could be credentials, it can be employment history, it can be licenses, medical record, legal records, and what they call in the industry KYC records, know your customer, but essentially scanning of identity documents provided by various or commercial entities, plus biometrics of a person. So to us, all of those together create a digital identity, very hard to falsify.
So Ed, before we get too far along, especially for listeners who don't have a full understanding of how the identity verification process works right now, you mentioned some inefficiencies in the process, and that process can mean a number of different things. Can you expand on both what those inefficiencies are and the process you're referring to, and just give a little bit of a lay of the land so that listeners have a better understanding of the problems that you saw and that you're continuing to deal with and try to address?
Yeah. Thank you, Russ. So it changes by industry and by country. There are definitions of what sufficient documentation is for a healthcare processing or financial processing or even government processing. And as an example, I opened a bank account with one of the largest banks in the world just a couple of years ago, and they asked me for a copy of my driver's license. And I said, what are you going to do with this? And they said, well, we just needed to send it to our back office. So they made a physical copy, and they had to actually send it via fax or FedEx to someone in the back office to process. And then they said, we'll just get back to you when the account is ready. 2 weeks later, they called me and said, listen, can you come back to the branch? And after I came back to the branch, they said, we lost a copy of your driver's license from the previous time you were here. Can you give us another copy? And I said, how do you know that someone else doesn't have it? They said, well, we shred all the documents at the end of the day. I said, but how do you know if you don't know where the document is? How do you know they shredded it? So, and this went on and on. Actually, they asked me for my driver's license 3 times. And this is one of the largest banks in the world. That's one example. The other examples is, other examples could be, for example, in the medical field, where you have medical professionals, and we have a plethora of examples. All you need to do is Google search, medical false identities, and you'll see that there are doctors and nurses and other professionals that have treated patients. Sometimes they've treated minors, and they've claimed to have, professional designations that they didn't, which created a large exposure to lawsuits and so forth. And the last thing I would mention also in that space is, the ability to follow through and understand license creation for individuals in different fields. We've seen it specifically in legal, and we've seen it in healthcare, where people have no license, their license expired, and for some reason they don't know about it, or they forgot, or they didn't pay, and then they keep on practicing without a license, which causes significant exposure to obviously legal issues, insurance issues, and other claims, and revenue collection issues. So there are a lot of inefficiencies across this, and this is just a representation of some examples we've seen in the United States. I would say that the U.S. is probably better than most countries around the world, but there are countries that are a little bit ahead, and most countries around the world are behind, which means these things just are much worse. And so the opportunities to solve this problem are material across the world.
Ed, you talked before about the different layers of ID, and how do all of those layers come together in order to verify ID?
So that's a very good question. And I think if you think about the simplest layer, where everybody's claiming today to have digital identity, but we would claim that they don't, or it's not sufficient, is just the scanning of the identity document. It's a first step in our view to have high probability of understanding that person who they claim to be. But right now, you would need, with our solution, to start validating additional layers. And the additional layers or building blocks could be an education verification. So if the verification is done directly with the source, and the name matches, and the ID matches, and there are other factors that are matched, then in addition to the identity document, you have a primary source verification of the individual's data. And then you increase the strength of the digital identity. Same thing for employers. If we go to an employer, let's take an example, a large company, and someone is a lawyer at that company or general counsel, and the company validates that they actually work there now or worked there in the past, and it comes from a validated source, then again, that adds as a significant layer to the identity. So if you take all of them together and layer them on top of each other, you have the sum of all of them is actually significantly larger than each individual component with validating individual's identity. And what we do in addition to that, is use the biometrics like facial recognition or liveness test to compare those to the images on the document. It could be a driver's license and it could be an employee ID. So all of those together create a very strong sum of parts that come together to build a digital identity that's different than most of what's out there today.
From a strength perspective, is there a minimum number of layers that one would need in order to verify an identity? I mean, I understand that the more layers you have, the stronger the identity, but is there a minimum amount that would be needed in order to verify?
It's all relative. And the question, for example, is right now there is some of the pharmacies that are dealing with COVID vaccinations are having issues in validating the credentials of the providers that are administering the vaccine. So you tell me how important it is to get their driver's license to authenticate that they are who they claim to be, match the face with the driver's license to really authenticate that, make sure that they have a medical license to practice what they're actually administering, make sure that they work where they claim to be working. So then it depends on the user or the person who is receiving the treatment in that scenario, or the company that's hiring that person, of how comfortable they want to be the person who is administering it is who they claim to be. Because obviously if they're not, that could be a huge exposure. So they also want to expedite the process, so they cannot wait sometimes. So there's a balancing act. In every scenario, you hire a junior person to clean the hospital. Maybe that's not as important to validate all the layers as it is for a brain surgeon that has to provide surgery on the most sensitive part of the human body. So it really would depend on the level of depth that you want to go to validate the person's credentials, and how you want to use that in future, and how you want it to be auditable and so forth.
So let's take that and talk about user experience for a moment. You described a very frustrating situation where an ID was lost and you had to go back multiple times and repeat the process. Obviously, that's incredibly infuriating from a client or a customer perspective. But what you're describing is multiple layers. From the user experience, does this add a significant amount of time, a significant burden to the process that you worry that people will be so put off by the additional effort to get the same results, or at least in their eyes, the same result, right? Because whoever they're getting approved by at the end of the day, it's either pass, fail. So from their perspective, they just want the easiest process possible. How do you address that concern?
So it depends. And the reason I'm saying it depends is we're working with a global Fortune 500 payment processor. And they need to validate the people. And for them, most of the requirements globally consist of a scan of a passport, right? Or a driver's license in the local area where the person is residing. And they do a credit card scan. So they'll scan a credit card as well. And then they'll match, without technology, they'll match all of these pieces and they'll match the names and they'll do additional processing. For them, that's sufficient. And we are reducing the friction that the user experience in logging onto the system and having to wait for manual validation or an automated validation that takes a long time or is prone to a lot of errors. So this, from that perspective of this client, is a huge improvement in user experience when they come on the system. Our process, end to end, would take less than 5 seconds, including everything involved, scanning the credit card and scanning the identity document. However, again, if you want to get confirmation, if you're hiring a CEO of a public company and you want to go through the whole plethora of information, we solve for some of the things that background checks companies solve for, or even private investigators solve for, when we go directly to the source and validate the information. And there's an expectation of a longer time. So if it's a one-off situation, there's an expectation that will take longer, but the results are really, really important. So it really depends on where on that spectrum you lie. And I'll give you another quick example. Patient information. If there's an emergency situation and the patient can just have a mobile phone and they can get a QR code and that says he's insured, he's valid, he can get treatment, that's much faster than starting to get the person coming in asking for the insurance card, asking for the identity documents, and so forth. So really, in different situations, this reduces friction by a material factor, and that's the goal of what we're trying to do. So our clients are businesses, but the end beneficiary is the individual from around the world. He or she would have a significant benefit by reducing those headaches that I mentioned earlier with that large multinational bank. And I'll give one more quick example, actually. I also opened an account with another multinational bank just recently, and they had to go through a process where I needed to send emails with very sensitive information about my company and about myself. And I said, I'm not sending it. This is what we do for a living, not like this. So they created a secure process where I can submit those. But even in that secure process, I had to take a picture of my driver's license using my webcam like this, and they saw the information, and they had to send me an email back saying, oh, the information was a little bit fuzzy, can you do it again? So they took a literal picture, which means that they cannot scan the document itself for fraud. They cannot match the document itself at the speed. So that was very high friction that I experienced, and this is just a month ago, with, again, one of the largest names in the financial sector. And this is how they do business. And if we were able to integrate with them, and we're starting to work with them potentially, that would be a significant improvement from their perspective on reducing risk of fraud and reducing customer friction and improving satisfaction.
So just to take it a step back, so in some situations it could be, a very quick verification process. Others, if there's more credentialing that's needed to get verified, obviously that would take longer. What's the time frame, on average for a user to become onboarded into your platform to begin to have that process take place?
So it's interesting. Our platform works in both directions. The first point of entry is when the user, the individual, the customer, the patient, the user of the system is scanned in order to get in. And usually that would be in a form of a know your customer or a credential check or something like that. Those records are usually uploaded into our system in bulk, or it's done in real time. So either we get a bulk upload like we're doing now with a state entity in the United States, or we're going to get like this Fortune 500 payment company that those will come either at bulk plus on a real-time basis as these people are scanned. So that's the first entry to the system, where the users become familiar with us. They're introduced to the capabilities of the system and the different values of the credential wallet and what they can do for themselves, where they can start becoming owners of their data. As they are introduced to the platform, they can start sending out information from the platform to be validated. And then they increase their ownership of their data. And they're increasing also the validity or the authenticity of the data that they hold and knowing what's out there about them. So they become the repository of their own data as time progresses. And as they do it more and more, the value of this repository to them as individuals increases exponentially because they can use it for more and more services. So if they sign up for a bank account and that's how they got into the company to verify, they can then use that to sign up for another bank account or to sign up for a mortgage or a car lease. They signed up through a healthcare organization and they got healthcare records. They can share that with their provider for a follow-up check. So they get control of the system, and the more they add to it, the more they can share, the more they can benefit for it. And at the end of the day, our model requires that once the system has some scale into it, a more significant scale than we have today, people will start getting paid for their data being utilized by third parties. So when they share their data with someone and Verify gets paid for that, they will get a portion of the proceeds.
Allowing users to commoditize their own data is a very powerful prospect. I think that's fantastic.
Yeah.
Can you describe a little bit more about what a consumer could use or do with their wallet created on the Verify platform?
Yeah, so we have tested and went to market with mostly financial applications, digital advertising applications, and healthcare applications off the platform. So whether we tested provider data or and tested their backgrounds by way of identity, whether we tested information about providers of medical equipment and tested that the vendors are real on digital advertising, the affiliates and the publishers and the advertisers. On the banking side, the people who want to transact, whether they're businesses or invest. So all of those are different use cases of the system. As users starting to get more and more data into their wallet, the sky is the limit of how they can use it. It could be legal documents that people share in the form of a will or a sale of a document of a real estate asset or sale of another asset or any other documents that are sensitive that they want to hold under their possession and only share with people that they define as people with the right to access, with the need to access this. So this gives control of this information in a very strong way. Another application that we're looking at right now is vaccination verification, so verifying that someone was vaccinated in a digital way versus just, some other, either get a paper form like we used to get like these. This is not a COVID one, this is something else, or a vaccination for COVID, which is paper and can be easily modified or forged by others. Once all of it is digital in the credential wallet, it's impossible to fake because it's based on some technologies that do not allow it, but also it's easy to share and receive confirmation that the other side received it. There's unlimited use cases once you start doing this at scale. We've also been talking to some organizations about creating a parent capability for children monitoring of their vaccinations and credentials. So again, the currently, because this is such a wide market and an open greenfield opportunity, the opportunities are much larger than what the providers are able to provide.
So going back to something that you talked about before, the user experience, how would it look to actually transfer your verified ID in your wallet? So for example, if I work for an employer and as part of the conditions of my employment is they have to verify my identification, and they go through Verify and they do that, and now I have this wallet with my verified identity. If I wanted to share that verified identity with another source at some point, what's involved? Is it difficult to do?
It's as difficult as swiping left or right on the record, typing the email of the person you want to send it to, and pressing send.
And what do they receive?
The receiver has a web interface that they have to sign into, and then they receive the data from the user for a predefined period of time or for an unlimited time. That's defined by the user as well, or by contract. And that's it. And they see it, and they can validate it, and they can question it, and there's a communication. It opens a communication channel also between the individual and the receiver. So there's a lot of potential in there.
So you must have dealt with some recipients of this information who have never heard of you, who've never experienced this before. You must have gotten phone calls or emails saying, "What the hell is this?" What can you describe that process and what that looks like?
Well, it did happen, and it's a practice of brand building and trust building, and we have ways to show the receivers that the information is valid in a very unique way, which is part of the technology behind it is part of our trade secrets and patents that we've filed. But essentially, we have an audit trail that can show the receiver that this has been validated by a valid source. And if they don't want to go to the valid source or to the audit trail and really look at and read it, it's not that long, then they have the ability to actually receive the information of the person who verified the information, call them directly. And then once they've done it once or twice or three times, they say, okay, well, we know that what's coming from Verify is trustworthy.
If my identity has been verified, how concerned do I need to be about the security of my verified identity?
If it's anywhere outside of Verify, you should be very concerned. And at Verify, the information is stored in a tested and audited, secure backend solution that's now becoming fully decentralized. And as the transition to a fully decentralized storage happens, the security of the data is going to be increased by exponentially from where it is today, and allow the user to feel that it's economically and operationally very, very difficult and it's uneconomical to try to hack someone's data at that point. But right now, it's just very difficult technologically. And I would say that very few, if any, can hack it. But in the future, it become even more difficult. And then it's going to be also economically not feasible because the amounts of work that someone would have to do to retrieve one piece of data about an individual, and one piece of data is not necessarily the driver's license. One piece of data can be the corner of the driver's license. The amount of work that they have to do to just retrieve this blue part of the driver's license is immense, and it makes it. And then they have to do it again for the part next to it, and the part next to it, and the part next to it, and those are not stored in an orderly manner. So they will get a puzzle piece, and they can get different people's puzzle pieces, and it would require a significant effort, let's just say, to get this information. So once the information is stored, and once we are at that decentralized storage level, this information is commercially inaccessible.
So taking that a step further, the piece that the user is holding is inaccessible, but what about if I'm sharing my digital ID with somebody and now it's going out to a third party? What kind of security is there for that third party, or for me knowing that I've just given it to this third party? How do I guarantee that the third party doesn't share that data after I've shared it?
So there's no sharing functionality digitally for the other party unless there's authorization. We prevent, in some cases, printing. We cannot prevent print screen. We cannot prevent someone taking their phone and taking a picture of what they see on their computer screen. As far as I know, nobody can do that. But there's data expirations, automatic expirations. There is smart contract enablement somewhere in the process there. And there's some graphic mitigation that we are applying to ensure that if a picture is taken as a still picture and then shared, or even a video if possible, it's very easy to know that that's been faked. So we are working on and implementing some of those safeguards in order to ensure that part of the fraud capability is minimized. That also requires login, right? So the receiver has to log in and have a user account with Verify in order to be able to see the information, which also automatically reduces the ability to do it in a fraudulent way.
So just a point of clarification. Verify creates a wallet for an individual, verifies the identification, and you mentioned before that other documents can be uploaded to that wallet. I assume that's by both the individual user as well as other companies, agencies, government entities, etc., right?
Yes.
Since it's the customer's wallet, will that other entity, that corporation, that agency have the ability to retract it? Because you're describing a situation where certifications might expire or need to be renewed. Is there some level of control from that other third party?
So there's two aspects to this. One is the user does not have to accept everything that's sent to him. They can reject stuff. So if someone sends me a diploma from a university that says on it Russ, I will reject it. So it's not going to appear in my credential wallet. And then even if I accept it, there's a way to know that there's a mistake and then overwrite it. The use of blockchain creates some challenges with retrieving information back, but you can overwrite existing information with other information in order to make it invalid. You can invalidate it by date, by time, by sender, by receiver, by holder, or by new information. There's multiple ways to overcome that.
As a follow-up question to that, if a third party was sent information and then that information was overwritten and they still had access to the portal or the document that they were given access to, would their access be limited to what was initially sent, or if they went back into the portal, they would see that there had been a change?
It depends. It depends. So, for example, let's say I share with you, let's say I'm doing a telehealth, which is another field that we've looked at, or we're looking at actually right now. And let's say you're my doctor, and I got an X-ray, and I share with you my X-ray through the credential wallet. You have access to it. I can define that within 30 minutes after the call, the document expires. And if the document expires 30 minutes after, if you're the doctor and you say the next day, you say, I want to see what's going on, you will not get access to anything, old or new. But you can request access to the information again from the patient, me, and if I give you access, you will get access to the most current information we have in the system. So it depends on how it's set up, right? If it's continuous access, they will be, if necessary, notified that there's a new document. If it's continuous access and something was overwritten, they'll just see the new document. And if we decided to maintain, or the user decided to maintain both versions, that could be there as well. Depends on the setup by the receiving and sending and providing, so that multiple parties that are involved in setting up the information and the rules that govern accessibility to that information.
So Verify has a lot of different manners of verifying one's identification, and as we talked about, the level of verification can change. So I'm assuming the costs could also change too, depending on what the user or the client needed. Could you talk to us a little bit about costs for identity verification?
Yeah, it really depends on the use cases. So when you do millions of transactions for validating individuals for financial transactions, for example, the cost can be low single digit dollars or below with very, very large volumes. And those are just for validating specific pieces at a specific point of time and then move on to the next scenario. If it's concerning credentials and we get bulk uploads of hundreds of thousands or millions of documents into the system, there's usually a cost for that. And then the dissemination of that depends on the rules that are defined by the person or the company that have uploaded the information and the use cases for it, right? If it's just an old document that's stale and nobody's using, there's one. But if it's a document that continuously needs to be used, like a transcript, like a vaccination record, like things like that, those can be, charged on a per transaction basis, per use basis. So it depends on the bulk upload or if it's a one ad hoc upload. So all of those things would vary with the intensity and churn of the data, and size of the data could also be relevant. We're talking about videos, for example, for medical stuff. We're talking about high resolution images. Those require more storage. They require different handling in some scenarios because you have to keep them at high resolution. So each one of those would have a different cost associated with it based on the operational burden that it creates when ingesting it in the system, sharing it with the user, having the user store it. As an example, if the user stores everything on their phone like other people do, but you have a 10 gigabyte document, it could be a certain type of imaging that they do or a certain type of repositories of information, that does not work well with a phone. That can essentially crash the phone. So in many cases, that would have to be stored offline and only accessed when necessary to view. And when it's shared, it's not shared from the phone, but it's shared from the offline access. So it really depends on, there's really multiple scenarios here how this would work and would be charged for, depending on the use case and the type of data.
So let's say that I have a Verify wallet and I use it and I send my...
You don't?
No. Let's say I do. Touche. So let's say that I have a Verify wallet and I use it and I'm sharing or not sharing, but I'm granting access to my ID. What happens if Verify goes out of business? What happens to my wallet?
That's a good question, and it's complex in the way to answer it. The idea is that you always have access to your storage, regardless of the data that's in there and regardless of Verify. Once we complete all the work, the development work that we're doing based on the patents we filed and so forth. When that happens, even if Verify doesn't exist, you will have uninterrupted access. But without the interface, it would be akin to the green squigglies in the matrix sometimes that you would have to read. Or it would be very rudimentary in your ability to interact with the data. You'll have the data, and if it's stored as a PDF and so forth, you'll be able to access it, retrieve it. But sharing it, if Verify is not there, would be more complex. You'll have to share it by downloading it and sending it. But the data itself, you will not lose access.
And in light of the pandemic, have you seen an increased amount of digital ID and the need for identity verification given the fact that we are all working remotely and electronically?
Yes. And to give more details, the interactions that are happening around the world with counterparts, clients, customers have changed during the last 12 months. And people need to keep on transacting both for personal but also for business purposes. And the need to identify still exists. I can tell you that a lot of financial institutions are looking at better ways to do that, but most of the ones that we deal with are still using phones and the same verification methods that they've used before COVID. And I just spent some pleasant time with some banks on the phone today to verify my own information for my company, and they still ask me for my last 4 digits of my social, and they ask me for the street address of the office and things like that. But the more forward-thinking organizations, especially when it comes to telehealth and others, have worked harder to be able to provide a more seamless identity verification process for both sides. Few of them are providing verifications to the patient as it pertains to the doctor and their credentials, and that's something that we're working on. But some have provided more information about the patient themselves and validating them before they're able to access an app or to access the provider. So it's becoming more prevalent, and I think the world as we know it has changed because of COVID, and there'll be more transactions online than post-COVID than pre-COVID, and there'll have to be efficiencies there, and we believe that we are at the forefront of that. We are able to provide a frictionless experience of identity validations, both sides of a transaction, in better ways than most companies around the world.
What do you see as the roadblocks or uniformity in digital identification as opposed to some companies or some entities still using what you said, verifying your mother's maiden name or your address? Why isn't this universal?
Because legacy systems still exist, legacy procedures still exist in very, very large organizations and small organizations as well. Very hard to change those because it requires changes across the organization, and it requires cost, and it requires attention. And the second factor, which attaches the first factor, is change. A lot of people don't like change. And people say it works, why change? But with this, one of the clients that we're working with, the potential cost savings are 10x, 10 times cheaper if they use our solution versus their existing procedures. And that's a number that trickles up to management very quickly when we're talking about millions of transactions a year. So those are some of the things that are preventing this. But, you know, as our economies advance, as people have to cut costs, as people are becoming more and more competitive for the attention and for the time and for the money of customers, they have to provide them better experiences because people have alternatives and they'll go somewhere else. So organizations that do not change, and in my view, in the next 5 to 10 years, organizations that do not use digital identity to interact with their constituents will fail.
So you were mentioning the world of COVID and how it's shaped digital identification. Get out your crystal ball, and can you make a prediction in the post-COVID world? Let's say 2 years out. Then let's also say 10 years out. What are your predictions about what happens to the identification world? Verify aside, just in general, what we'll see, what you think we'll see, what you hope to develop over that time frame.
So it's hard to put verify aside because that's what we're trying to address. We're trying to create a situation where people have the ability to use their mobile phones and maybe in the future their watches and maybe in the future other things to really unambiguously identify themselves when they need to and they want to a counterparty. So I'm not saying you need to use this in transactions of one kind versus another. That's up to the regulators, the compliance officers, and people that manage organizations to decide. But if someone does need to verify unequivocally the other person or the other company on the other side of it, they will have to do it very quickly and efficiently. And we're one of the companies, but we're a leader in building solutions that enable that very frictionless experience and quick validation of information in a way that's hard to dispute. And the faster we do it, and the more accurate the result is, and the less disputable it is, and the stronger it can be auditable later on, the higher the chances of success and adoption. Now, in 2 years from now, I fear that we will be in a similar place to where we are today. 10 years from now, it's a different story. I think it's similar to electric cars or self-driving cars. In 10 years from now, my kids might not need a driver's license. And I think in 10 years from now, people asking us about our social security number will not exist as well. I hope at least.
We've talked a lot about user experiences and what businesses are doing or should be doing to verify identity. And I know you work a lot in the international space. Are you seeing any governments that are really leading the charge in helping modernize this identity verification process?
That's a great question. So a very well-known example is a system called Aadhaar, which is implemented in India. And over 1 billion people in India received something akin to a digital identity. It's not real, it's complex. But that improved the lives of millions, hundreds of millions of people because they had access to stuff that they didn't have before this was put in place. It took a long time. It was very expensive. But India is such a big country, and they were able to do something that most people believe that cannot be done. Sweden, Estonia, Israel, and other countries around the world have started their own efforts of creating digital identities. I think Estonia is leading that way. But there are other countries around the world, like Singapore, that are making some material strides. So the more this happens, and the more we can help with those types of scenarios, I think the better off the citizens of those countries would be across the globe, in those countries, but also when they start traveling across the world.
Ed, are you finding that any governments in the United States are using this technology to do identity verification?
There have been some attempts by several states to try to create digital identities. I actually read something about Toronto trying to create a digital version of their driver's license just recently. I think that none of those pilots have matured to more than just a test in the United States at this point. And I think the identity document, Real ID, that was implemented in order to allow people to use a driver's license to travel better and more surely, or at least from the identity perspective in the United States, is a big step from the US perspective. But I don't think it's a big enough step into digital identity and the opportunities that it holds. So in the United States, I think we're still lagging behind, and we are actually trying to fix that, both the state and federal level, with some conversations we're having. But the road is still wide open.
We've covered a lot of ground here, and Verify is doing a lot of things. Are there any other particular projects that you're working on that you want to share?
Well, we are very excited about the financial services opportunities we have, obviously, because those are large and can provide us with, material user bases and other opportunities, such as giving people better experiences. But the state opportunity that we're working on right now allows us to provide efficiencies at a state level, a large state level. And that could trickle up to other areas or across to other areas within the state and other states as well. So that's very exciting for us. And the opportunity for us to present something at the federal level, which hopefully will take place in the coming weeks, will be very significant from that perspective. If we can help people get better loans, better access to funding, better access to employment and other benefits, just because they're starting to use more and more of the functionality that's inherent in our view in digital identity, that would be tremendous. We're also working on improving the process within the healthcare space to provide, to ensure that the providers are qualified, they're tested, their backgrounds are fine, and deliver them, and then the companies can deliver them faster to where they're needed, which is, again, very exciting from our perspective because we are not in the healthcare space as a company. We don't provide healthcare tools or vaccines or medicines or anything of that nature, but if we can help get the providers to the right place at the right time and with the information, and we can help one person, that would be a big win for us. And it is already. We've already been able to do that to some extent. So those are some of the things we're doing. We're excited about. There are plenty of opportunities within healthcare and the legal fields, and others that we have not even touched, even supply chain opportunities that we're looking at. So all of these things are significant on their own, and we're trying to sometimes just pick the ones that we can make the most impact on at the shortest amount of time because of limited resources, obviously.
Ed, one last question. Obviously, you're not doing this full lift by yourself. Can you describe the team that you're working with?
Yeah, thank you for that. So I consider myself very fortunate. We have amassed a group of people that are highly qualified and highly motivated to provide these solutions to anywhere we decide as a company we want to focus on. And it starts from the board of directors that I have, the advisory board that I have, and the management team. We have our COO, Colleen Connors, who's wonderful and has been really helping me build this company for the past 4 years. We have our CTO, who's recently joined us. We have our chief architect and our various VPs in different areas, such as product and business development and sales, that really helped bring to the forefront all of the developments and the ideas that we've accumulated over the past few years and create products that are unique and disruptive invaluable for both clients and individuals. So I'm very proud of the team that I have, junior as senior, and everybody else in the company that's helped, including investors and other stakeholders. And, I'm looking forward to growing that team and doing more and more in the years to come.
And if listeners want to get in touch with you or learn more about Verify, how can they do so?
So Verify is spelled VERIF-Y, and that's verify.com. And to reach me, people can call our offices. I think the number's on the website, or they can always email info@verify.com, and someone will get back to them pretty quickly. There's also a chat service on the website or an email service.
So on behalf of Jen, Justin, and myself, you've been listening to the latest episode of the Digital Planning Podcast. Our guest today was Ed Zabar, founder and CEO of Verify. Ed, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Digital Planning Podcast, the podcast designed to educate individuals about all things digital in connection with estate planning, business planning, and estate administration. Please subscribe to this podcast and leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, or wherever you download your podcasts. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.
This podcast is not intended nor should be relied upon as legal advice, nor is it creating any attorney-client relationship with a listener and the hosts or guests. The information provided is only for educational and informational purposes, and the information provided will likely change.